Answered in kind. 70. The tyranny of the crowd, the seduction of approval, and the quiet majesty of the unfettered soul. Your bitterness betrays you. Your judgment betrays you. Your pride betrays you. Indeed, there are betrayals far subtler than treachery of blade or tongue. The most insidious betrayals are those a person commits against the quiet sovereignty of their own being. Many wander through life burdened by secret tremors, petty anxieties, social phantoms, imagined condemnations. They cloak these fears beneath elaborate performances of certainty, yet the tremor persists beneath the skin like a low electrical current. In truth, much of what people hide is little more than a pitiful apprehension of the gaze of others. And yet, the irony is magnificent. For the simple act of standing firmly within one's own truth, calmly, unapologetically, without theatrical rebellion or performative bravado, radiates a confidence so natural that it dissolves these anxieties in the same way sunlight annihilates fog. What seemed an insurmountable terror is revealed to have been nothing more than vapor. Still, the multitude rarely chooses this path. Instead, they bow, almost ritualistically, before the invisible tribunal of collective opinion. Be wary of the crowd. For the crowd is not merely a gathering of individuals. It is a peculiar psychological organism, an entity with its own gravitational pull, its own peculiar metabolism of fear and approval. Once one enters its orbit, one discovers that descent becomes progressively more difficult. Not because dissent is impossible, but because belonging begins to masquerade as virtue. And so the mind whispers its familiar rationalization. They cannot all be wrong. But this proposition, upon inspection, is not a proof at all. It is merely the sedative hum of conformity. How, after all, could one discern the falsity of a belief if every surrounding voice reinforces it? When the echo becomes indistinguishable from the original sound, the illusion of certainty becomes almost total. Thus arises one of the most tragic bargains of human social life. There often comes a moment when a person sees further than the group. A flicker of clarity arrives, quiet, unassuming, but undeniable. Yet, to speak it aloud risks expulsion from the very community that once provided comfort. And so, many choose silence. They surrender their insight at the altar of belonging. But what happens when the crowd, intoxicated with its own unanimity, commits something abhorrent? When a chorus of agreement transforms folly into doctrine and outrage into moral theater? In such moments, the group becomes curiously fragile. It may collapse entirely, scattering its members like startled birds. And yet, even then, few possess the courage to say the simplest words in the human lexicon. I was wrong. Instead, they huddle together defensively, confusing solidarity with bravery. In this strange alchemy of social psychology, cowardice begins to masquerade as loyalty. The need for approval is a most peculiar affliction. It resembles a black hole in the moral architecture of the psyche, an insatiable maw of external validation, devouring dignity, authenticity, and intellectual independence with equal enthusiasm. One throws fragment after fragment of the self into this void, opinions, preferences, creative impulses, hoping the abyss might finally be satisfied. It never is. The applause fades. The approval evaporates. The fleeting triumph dissolves into shadow. And so the cycle begins again. A careful equilibrium must indeed exist within any human collective. Groups can nurture, protect, and elevate the individual. But when a group becomes emotionally inflamed, when it is fueled by outrage, resentment, or moral grandstanding, the equilibrium tilts dangerously. Outrage, after all, is an intoxicant. Once ingested, it narrows perception until one peers through a mere pinhole of awareness. Nuance evaporates. Complexity becomes intolerable. The world is sorted hastily into saints and villains. In this condition, people become astonishingly susceptible to the very dangers they believe themselves to be opposing. The fire of indignation, if left unexamined, eventually consumes the moral clarity that ignited it. Thus emerges the most tragic misunderstanding of all, the confusion of anger with righteousness. One may even hear teeth gnashing in the name of the divine. Curious, is it not? For many declare with unwavering certainty that God is love, and yet they speak endlessly of what God despises. They catalogue divine hatred with a kind of bureaucratic precision. But this notion collapses upon philosophical inspection. Hatred is typically born from ignorance. When genuine understanding arises, deep, penetrating comprehension of circumstance, history, psychology, the impulse to hate dissolves into something far more complex: compassion, grief, or sober recognition. If one truly understood, hatred would become exceedingly difficult, and so the perpetual blame game begins to appear rather absurd. Blame offers the psychological equivalent of a child's toy: simple, gratifying, momentarily satisfying. Yet, toys are not meant to sustain the architecture of adult consciousness. Blame may provide temporary relief, but it rarely produces illumination. Indeed, many early stages of psychological development cling to blame as though it were a warm hearth during winter. But there is no hearth. it is closer to pressing one's hands against open flame. Remain too near it, and one soon forgets the difference between warmth and burning. Human beings often play with dangerous emotions as though they were harmless amusements. Resentment, vindictiveness, bitterness. Yet these are no toys. They sting, they bite, they leave psychic scars invisible to the naked eye. Still, people cling stubbornly to these emotional barbs as if they were life preservers. Imagine a person gripping a rigid wire suspended above water, terrified of falling, unaware that liberation would require nothing more heroic than releasing their grip. But the knot of bitterness in the belly protests violently. It demands explanations from a world that refuses to be simplified. It demands coherence from the incoherent. And so the mind churns. To dwell endlessly upon vicious thoughts is much like a serpent devouring its own tail. An Ouroboros of resentment, spinning in frantic circles while imagining forward progress. Some run this mental race with such desperate intensity that they fail to notice the obvious truth. There was never a race to win. This realization alone could liberate entire lifetimes of unnecessary suffering. Yet many rush through existence with extraordinary haste, propelled by invisible expectations. They hurry past childhood, sprint through adolescence, accelerate through youth, and arrive breathless at adulthood, only to pause and ask, what exactly was I rushing toward? By 30, many remain standing precisely where they began, bewildered, exhausted, and dimly aware that they sprinted past something precious along the way. The wind in their hair, the quiet astonishment of simply being alive, the subtle ecstasy of noticing. To hell with what the majority believes, not out of adolescent contrarianism, but out of intellectual honesty. For the beliefs of the majority are often little more than a grand social game of telephone. Ideas pass from mouth to mouth, generation to generation, mutating quietly along the way until their origins become unrecognizable. Yet few possess the curiosity to examine the historical logs of these transformations. To do so risks separation from the group, and separation, for many, feels intolerable. But one must ask a dangerous question. If a group cannot pause long enough to consider what you have discovered, if it cannot sit beside you for a moment of quiet recognition, watching the sunset of a shared insight, then how valuable is that companionship? If one's company cannot even witness the horizon with you, what exactly are they sharing? Many individuals live lives measured entirely by the ticks of clocks. They watch the minutes crawl across office walls, waiting for the workday to conclude so they may rest, only to awaken and repeat the same ritual again. Time becomes a mechanical tyrant, quantized into units of productivity and exhaustion. Yet time, philosophically speaking, resists quantification. It expands in moments of wonder and collapses during monotony. A single hour of authentic presence may contain more life than 10 years spent in unconscious repetition. To believe otherwise is to sell oneself tragically short. Is this truly all life has to offer? Many believe that remaining within the crowd will protect them from loneliness. They surrender their peculiarities, their creative eccentricities, their authentic curiosities in exchange for a fragile sense of belonging. But something strange happens. Having sacrificed the very qualities that made them unique, they begin to feel hollow. They experience a persistent dissatisfaction, but cannot quite diagnose its cause. So they conclude that something must be wrong with them. In reality, nothing is wrong with them. They simply abandoned themselves. And still they maintain appearances. They polish the mask. They rehearse the approved opinions. They suppress the luminous impulses stirring beneath the surface. For many could be radiant beyond imagination. They possess strange and marvelous interior worlds, visions, ideas, creative sparks capable of illuminating entire landscapes of possibility. Yet these lights are dimmed beneath the grimy windows of societal expectation. The world fills with copyists. Mimicry becomes fashionable. Safe repetition replaces daring originality. Individuals hesitate to step even 1 inch beyond the mapped territory of social approval. For the unknown is frightening. Yet the unknown is precisely where creativity resides. It is there, beyond the polite boundaries of imitation, that one encounters the deeper strata of the human spirit, the uncharted chambers of imagination, the strange, wild gardens of authentic expression. To venture there requires courage, but the reward is immeasurable. For the person who finally releases their grip on the wire of approval discovers something astonishing. They do not plummet into isolation as they feared. Instead, they begin to experience a rare and subtle form of freedom. The freedom to think clearly. The freedom to speak honestly. The freedom to create without permission. And in this freedom, something remarkable happens. The bitterness dissolves. The judgments soften. The pride, no longer a brittle shield, transforms into quiet dignity. For the individual who stands calmly within their truth no longer requires the applause of the crowd. They have rediscovered something far more enduring. The simple, luminous sovereignty of being.